processing automatically maintains a bunch of global variables for us to use in our programs. In this video, we'll look at 6 of the most important ones. Before we get started, I'll note that I've said that I always capitalize the first letter of my own global variables. Though that rule works well for my own variables, processing itself doesn't use that convention. I wish it did, but it doesn't. So each of the globals that we'll see here starts with a lowercase letter. The 2 global variables that you'll use the most often are width and height, which tell us the size of the graphics window. By default, they each have a value of 100, meaning that processing's default graphics window is a square 100 pixels on a side. But when you call size, processing overwrites these default values with the numbers that you hand to size. So if you say size 800/600 at the top of your program, then from then on, the global variable width is 800 and the global variable height is 600. Now you might completely reasonably think that if you change the values in these globals, you can change the size of your graphics window, but that doesn't work. All of the variables that processing maintains for us are for us to use, but we must never, ever assign new values to them. That will almost always cause havoc. Your program will just go haywire. These variables are meant to show us what processing is thinking, but if we change them, the system doesn't change to match. Instead, we now have a mismatch between the values of the variables and the reality they're supposed to be describing. I wish processing had made it illegal to assign values to these globals, so if you tried, your program would stop. But it doesn't do that. If you try to assign a value to width or to height, or any of the other globals that we'll see here, processing will let you do it. But expect your program to go completely bonkers before long. The value of width and height is that you can use them in your program rather than actual numbers representing the size of your graphics window. Here's a little sketch that does nothing but draw one circle in the middle of the graphics window. My graphics window is 600 by 300, and I'm drawing the ellipse with an X value of 300. So horizontally it's centered. If I run this, I will get a graphics window with a circle right there, horizontally centered. Now suppose I decide later, I really want a square graphics window. I don't want it to be 600 by 300. Instead, I want it to be 300 by 300. And now I run my program again. Well, of course, it's not going to be centered anymore because now the number that I have for the center of the ellipse is 300. That's now the right-hand edge of the graphics window. So if instead I use the global width and divide it by 2, then I always will have the ellipse centered in the window. So now I can run this again, and it's centered. And if I pick some other size, let's say 450, I don't have to change a thing. If I run it again, my ellipse is centered. If I make it really wide, let's call it 750, it's still centered. So the beauty of using width is that it is always set automatically by processing to the width of the graphics window. And I can always do things like centering very easily. And of course, height does the same thing. Let's change this to be height over 2.0. If I run it, it'll still be vertically centered. But now I can make the graphics window much taller. Let's say 800. We'll make it huge. And it will still be vertically centered in the graphics window. The words width and height belong to their globals, so the words are reserved. That means that you shouldn't have variables of your own called width and height. And that's a shame. Those are such useful words when we work with geometry, but that's how it is. So you'll probably end up calling your variables things like box height or table width, rather than just width and height. Remember, all you have to change is just one letter, and you have a new name. Notice that width and height extend right up to the limits of the graphics window, but that height in particular does not include the little bar at the top, where the operating system puts the name of the sketch in the window buttons. Width and height refer to this part of the graphics window, the part where we can actually draw. Let's now look at the other popular global variables. As we saw in our discussion of animation, frame count is very useful. It tells us the frame number that we're drawing now. So the first time we go into draw, frame count has the value 1. The next time it's 2, then 3, then 4, and so on as long as the program runs. The other 3 globals we'll look at all have to do with the keyboard and the mouse. Now I discussed these in detail in their own videos, but for now I'll just mention their names and generally what they do. When you press or release a key on the keyboard, processing saves the character corresponding to that key in the global variable key. The position of the mouse in the graphics window is always given by the values of these 2 globals, mouse X and mouse Y, spelled in this funny way with a capital letter at the end. Well, that's it. Let's recap all 6 of these important globals. Width and height tell us the size of the graphics window. If we call size, as we usually do at the start of setup, then they automatically take on the numbers that we handed to size. Frame count tells us which frame we're drawing, starting at 1 and going up forever. Key tells us which keyboard key was just pressed or released. Mouse X and mouse Y tell us where the mouse is located in the graphics window. The 2 critical things to keep in mind are these. First, never create variables with these names. They're reserved for processing. If you create a variable with the same name as any of these, you're going to hide the global, and it's almost certain that crazy things will happen. Second, and most important, never assign to these global variables. Use them in your code. Use them freely all over the place, but never put new values into them. Only processing itself should put values into these globals. Processing maintains lots of global variables for us to use, but you'll find that these 6 are the ones you're going to find most useful in your own programs.